the halachas of Pas Akum apply at the time of baking, and therefore, if at the time it was baked by a baker, then it's okay. And if even if it later switched hands to a private, he sold it to a private person, it would still be permitted, and vice versa. If at the time it was baked by a private individual and later sold to a baker, that would be problematic because we go after the time of baking. With the exception being, which we mentioned earlier, the Shulchan Aruch says that if a baker invites somebody to their house, it's still problematic. So we didn't understand because I thought at the time of the baking it was baked by a baker. It's okay. So we discussed many different possible solutions to that. One would be that it would, since he invited to his house, so that's a separate problem. Okay, now the Shulchan Aruch tells us something fascinating. He said, Yesh mish omer, there are those who say that let's say there's not even baked bread from bakers. Mutter afil shel balabatim. It's permitted to get even from a balabayis, even from a private person. And the Rama says you don't have to wait for good bread to come. So the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that if there's no bakery in town, you can even go to your next door neighbor. And again, this is all assuming that the food's kosher, which nowadays is going to be much more complicated. But in theory, if we know that all the food's kosher, it would be permitted. There's actually a bit of a discussion, a technical discussion. What is the Shulchan Aruch basing this heter on? So if you look in the Berurah, who provides the source for the Shulchan Aruch's rulings, he said this is based on the shita of the Ra'ah. If you remember, we mentioned a shita that said that there could be that the entire prohibition was never really accepted to begin with. So if that's the case, if the entire prohibition was never accepted to begin with, so obviously we normally don't go this, but b'shas l'chach, in a tough spot, one may rely on this. However, if that's the case, then in practice one would not rely on this, because the Shulchan Aruch actually says this in the language of yesh mish omer. There are those who say, and we have a rule that any time the Shulchan Aruch brings an earlier opinion and then later says a yesh omer, we don't follow the second opinion. We follow halachic kistam. Halachic is like the regular opinion. Therefore, one would not rely on this. However, the Berurah's grandson or great grandson, the Vilna Gaon, brings a different source, and that is from the halacha of demai. Demai is when we're not sure if truma was taken off. So normally it's not allowed to be taken. Normally one may not eat demai, which is questionable whether truma is taken off. However, in a case of when there's no other options, even a regular person may eat demai. So according to this, there would be room to rely on it, but again, this is going to be less relevant nowadays when we wouldn't even be able to determine if it's kosher. Okay, then the next halacha is very interesting, because as we know, we're not dealing with a question of is the bread kosher, but rather we want to create this separation. And because of this reason, the Shulchan Aruch gives us three options of how to create this separation, even without technically the Jewish person fully baking the bread. So the first is, let's say the non-Jew lights the fire, but then the Jewish person puts the bread inside. So that's one way that this would be acceptable and no longer susceptible to the laws of Pas Akum. Or let's say the Jewish person lights it, and then the non-Jew puts it in. So that's okay because he lit the fire. And finally, the third case is even if the non-Jew lit the fire and he put it in, but the Jew comes in and kind of stokes the coals a little bit, this is all permitted. And he says even if he even throws in just like a small piece of wood, he does some type of small action to enhance the fire. This is all permitted because again, this whole purpose is just to create the hecker, to create a separation, and this would all be okay. So this, how do we apply this in the modern day application? So if you go to the different kosher agencies have different standards and procedures regarding, nowadays mostly it's remote, right? Very often these things are remote. So can one rely on, let's say you have a mashgiach, right? He's sitting in the comfort of his home back wherever he lives in New York, and there's a bakery somewhere in the middle of Indiana, and he opens his phone and presses the button. So do we say that technically the Jew did it, so we have the hecker? Or do we say that no, it's got to be, there's got to be some type of in-person, visit to ensure that there is some type of, a hecker. Similarly, let's say you have, back then they didn't have such a thing. You could just turn on an oven and it goes continuously. Let's say you have these ovens which you turn on once a year, or once, in a lifetime, right? Because it could stay on. Back then you used to constantly put in wood and back, put more and more wood. So nowadays, can you technically have a Jew go down to the plant, turn it on once, and you're good to go? So in this latter case, most poskim are not so happy with this, and it's quite understandable because, again, we're trying to create a hecker, and it's very hard to believe that somebody turning on once in their lifetime or in the first case where the person's turning on his phone, that's a little more questionable. I think I'd have to look. I think there are some agencies that rely on this and some don't. But that's basically the question of the modern day application of trying to create this hecker.